everybody. Welcome back to the Scott Wingerter Show. We have a very special treat for you today. We sat down last week and interviewed Mr. Mark Meckler, who is the president of Convention of States Action. And so we're going to get into what that organization is all about. So Convention of States is this idea that we're going to call a convention of states. So state legislatures have to pass in their own states legislation that's calling for a convention of states. And so real quick, I'm going to read to you Article 5 of the Constitution, and then we can go in from there. So Article 5 says this: the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes, as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clause of the 9th section of the first article, and that no state without its consent shall be deprived of equal suffrage in the Senate. So that whole first and fourth clause of the 9th section, that was talking about basically leaving slavery alone. In the original Constitution, it said we're not going to touch the institution of slavery until 1808. And then after 1808, then we can do things. And as soon as 1808 came into being, the Congress passed a law that basically banned the international slave trade, and Thomas Jefferson signed it. So the point here is this: how do we amend the Constitution, right? So the Constitution has two methods by which we can amend it, all right? On September 15th, 1787, only the first method was in the original Constitution. And Colonel George Mason, who was a delegate from Virginia, he was looking at this and he said, look, if you only empower the federal government to be able to amend the Constitution, what happens if you have an out-of-control tyrannical government that is in place in Washington, D.C., and they're just trampling over everybody's rights? Do you really think that they're going to propose amendments that would rein in their power? We really need a second mode of passing amendments that is absent of any interaction from the federal government. And so he proposed the second clause of Article 5. And it's worth noting that that was universally adopted by every delegate in the Constitutional Convention at the time. So nobody objected at all. It just passed. And so what the Convention of the States is this organization that's trying very hard to get the 34 states necessary to pass these resolutions in their state legislature. And if you get to 34, the only thing that the federal government has to do with it is to call the convention. And they're probably going to call it in Washington, D.C. But then once they call the convention and the delegates are sworn in and they arrive and they conduct their first day of business, they can close that convention and reconvene it wherever they want. And they can do with it whatever they want because they're their own independent body at that point. And so it's really important to understand that this is absolutely essential. This is how we get back to a restoration of the America that was founded in 1776 and the Constitution that came out of the late 1780s that founded our republic. We've gotten really far away from that original document, and I think it really needs to be brought back. And the only way that that's going to happen is through an Article 5 Convention of States. So I'm a huge proponent of Convention of States. I have been for years, since 2014, when I first really started thinking about this. There was a book out. I'll put it in the description down below if you want to pick up a copy. It's Mark Levin is the author, and it's called the Liberty Amendments. And he goes through and he argues in the first chapter basically the same thing that I just told you about, how we need a convention of states. And then he goes through the rest of his book arguing for his list of what he would like to see as amendments coming out of that convention of states. The biggest thing is we need to restore federalism, all right? Once you pass stuff like the 17th Amendment, for example, which is the direct election of senators, what you're really doing is you're neutering the power that the states once had. And so I would get rid of the 17th Amendment if I could. I want state legislatures to basically elect the senators for the state. Remember, senators are there to represent the state, not the people. The people have congressmen, like my congressman's Morgan Luttrell, or some of my neighbors down the street. It's a different congressional district. Their congressman's Dan Crenshaw. All right. It depends on where you live, obviously, but you have direct representation in the House of Representatives by your congressmen, your senators, in this case, John Cornyn and Ted Cruz, which represent my state, Texas. They represent Texas, not Scott Wingerter. All right. And I think it's a much better plan, a much better idea to have the state legislatures elect those senators, because I bump into my state reps all the time in this area. I was having lunch sitting next to Will Metcalf the other day. I bump into Steve Toth often. I have State Representative Cecil Bell's phone number. I can call him. He'll answer the phone. Be like, "What's up, Scott?" These guys know me. They live in our community. We bump into them. They have to face us, when we're at the grocery store and we're walking. They have to buy groceries too. We see them. They're directly accountable to us. They have to face us. I've met Ted Cruz 3 times now. All right. And he's a really pleasant guy, shakes my hand. Nice to meet you. Right. But he doesn't remember me. He doesn't know me. He's not really accountable to me. So getting rid of the 17th Amendment would be awesome, right? Because it's going to give states power back. And we'll get into that when we talk to Mark Meckler here in a few minutes. But ideas like putting term limits on Congress. Do you think Congress is going to place term limits on themselves? Of course they're not. You can look at something like the 27th Amendment. The Constitution's been amended 27 times, okay? The 27th Amendment, which passed in the early 1990s, I think it was 1991 or 92, but basically what that said is if you have a new Congress that comes in and they get sworn in, they cannot immediately vote on a raise for themselves. So any raise that they might have as far as their paycheck is concerned doesn't go into effect until the next Congress is sworn in. All right. So that's a pretty cool amendment, but it took hundreds of years in order to get that amendment ratified. The 27th Amendment was introduced along with the Bill of Rights. So the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Third Amendment, the Fifth Amendment. Back in 1791, in the very first Congress, the 27th Amendment was was voted on and passed the House and the Senate and went to the several states. And it wasn't until the 1990s that even got passed. So my point is, Congress is not going to be in a huge hurry to limit themselves, right? I think an Article 5 Convention of States is definitely necessary when you look at how polarized we are. The other thing that it does for us is we don't have to have a violent revolution in order to fix the Constitution. Right? If the federal government were to become this horrible, tyrannical, despotic state, right? We don't have to take up arms and fight the federal government and overturn that government with a coup and then reestablish a new constitution. It's a whole messy, bloody business, right? Now, we just call a convention of states and they can't stop it because it is already a constitutional power that the states have. It's That's that federalism. That's that balance that I was trying to talk about a moment ago, and how important that balance is. So, revolutions are horrible things for society. Sometimes they're necessary. I get that. However, if it's like anything, like it's like a fight, right? Like if I'm at a bar and some guy's like trying to pick a fight with me, I'm going to try to avoid that fight as much as I can. Now, sometimes you got to throw down, and I get that. What this does is it gives us a way out to avoid that fight. We can walk away from that bloody revolution, and we can put in new amendments and institute new policies and laws in order to protect our liberties, which is the point of what government is. Remember, the Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So the government is supposed to be there to protect your natural rights, all right? And the Constitution does that. That's the walking out of that idea. And so empowering state governments to call a convention of states is the best way to secure our way of life, to secure the blessings of liberty. And so I'm a huge proponent of the Convention of States. It's going to be up right now, as Mark Meckler is going to talk about. We have 19 states out of 34 that have signed on, and there's a plan, and we're going forth. We're going through every single state legislature trying to get them to pass this kind of legislation. The other main thing that a lot of people that are sort of against the Convention of the States, they say, oh, well, you got to be careful because there's, you could have a runaway convention. And this is all nonsense. All right. So let's say that 34 states do come together. They pass the Article 5 Convention of States. Congress calls it. They get together and, somehow somebody's like, hey, I think we should repeal the Second Amendment, right? Let's disarm America. Well, number one, I don't think that's going to pass that body, all right? Number one, remember, it would have to pass the Convention of States in order to go out to the state legislatures. But number two, you still need 3/4 of the several states. That's 75% of the state legislatures would have to vote in favor of repealing the Second Amendment. That's not going to happen. So there are checks and balances on this type of thing. And I just think that it is the only tool that we really have to restore federalism and to restore the balance of power and take it out of the hands of Washington, D.C., and in particular the bureaucratic state, or the deep state, if you will, the bureaucratic wing, the fourth branch of government, whatever you want to call it, unelected people who've been in these positions for like 30, 40 years, like Tony Fauci. He's unelected, basically unaccountable, and can do whatever he wants. Like, that is not what this document says that we should be doing with our government. And so we need to take that power back. And the best way to do that is through an Article 5 Convention of the States. So if you're watching this, we'll put a link down on the bottom to the Convention of States webpage, and you can see if, like, for example, North Carolina, if you've passed it in one chamber, you need to pass in the second chamber and get North Carolina on board. Pennsylvania, you guys need to pass Article 5 Convention of the States. Kansas we're working on it there, but there's lots of different states. Washington State has passed it in one of the chambers. You need two. We really need to get this movement going, because I think it's going to quell a lot of the civil unrest between the basically polar opposites of political parties right now. So call your state rep, call your state senator, tell them that you support an Article 5 Convention of the States and that you expect them to put forth a piece of legislation calling for an Article 5 Convention of the States, because it's how we're going to save our republic. So enough about it from me. Let's ask Mark Meckler some of the questions that I had for him and see what he has to say. Okay, Mark, thanks so much for being here.
Good to be with you.
All right, so real quick, how many states are we currently at as far as getting the Convention of States rolling?
So we have 19 so far. It takes 34 states to call a convention. We're halfway in North Carolina, so call it 19 and a half. We've passed the House, pending in the Senate right now. Kansas, also, we passed last year, but there's a question about whether they need a supermajority. That's being litigated right now. So I'd say we're pretty close to 21, but we're actually officially at 19.
Okay. You recently did, last year, I believe, a sort of practice version of what the Convention of States would look like. How did that work out?
So we did a simulated convention in Williamsburg, Virginia, a great place. I mean, kind of the birthplace of America. Mm-hmm. It was phenomenal. It was 2.5 days, brought in legislators from all over the country. Of course, it's only 2.5 days, so it's not like a full convention, but we got them in there. I think the most interesting thing to me was the level of debate, how intense it was. Mm-hmm. You know, most of these guys that we brought in, there are connections, so they're conservatives, generally, mostly Republicans. So you would think they all get along on everything. It was intense. They argued really intensely, very passionately, different opinions on balancing the budget and term limits and whether we need them, how long they should be. So I would say I was surprised by the level of intensity. But in the end, what you see is great statesmen and stateswomen come together and they proposed a bunch of amendments.
So if you could get a magic wand and wave it, give me your top 5 amendments that you would like to see come out of a convention of the states in order to save America.
Okay, so, and these are not necessarily realistic ones, because I think some of these things would be a stretch. I think my number 1 would be a repeal of the 17th Amendment.
That's my number 1.
Okay, so 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators. Most people don't realize the way senators used to be elected was they weren't. The state legislature would appoint a senator. I think that gives a great balance between state and federal power. Right now, senators are really beholden to the federal government and not to their states. That's a bad thing. So I would repeal that so that the state legislatures appoint senators.
I think that is so important because that is the literal mechanism, I think, that destroyed federalism.
I agree with that.
So your senators are not there to represent you. They're there to represent the state.
Absolutely.
And I would love, you go back to the Second Continental Congress, for example, Ben Franklin is just itching to vote for independence. But then when the first couple votes come up that it's heading that way, he declines to do so because he had to vote that way because he was responsible to the legislature.
Right.
And so you can have an amendment that would replace the 17th Amendment that did something similar. I think that would be a really good thing where, could you imagine if you had to have joint sessions of your House and your Senate in your state, giving a resolution to, in other words, instructions to your U.S. senators on how it is that they're going to vote on this treaty or this, nominee.
Yeah, and the reason I think this is difficult is because the narrative would be we're trying to take people's right to vote away from them.
Exactly.
And so I had a great suggestion actually from a Democrat legislator in Nebraska who said to me, well, the way we get this done is instead of saying that the legislature appoints, let the people still vote, but the legislature gets the right of recall. Yeah. And so I think this would be interesting because you could say to people, hey, look, the deal is your senators go to D.C., they get captured by the swamp. Yeah. Your state legislature ought to have the right to recall those people. And so I think that's a good compromise position. So that'd be my number 1 choice.
I love that idea.
Number 2 for me would be dealing with the Commerce Clause. Most people don't realize the Commerce Clause, very short clause the Constitution says that the federal government has the right to regulate interstate commerce. It was supposed to be a very limited power, allowing the federal government to intervene in disputes between the states, like over tariffs primarily.
But I think it was Justice Black in the 1930s, the FDR.
Yep, that is correct. So this is Wickard v. Filburn is the case where this happens. A massive expansion of federal power. It says the federal government can pretty much regulate anything, anytime, and call it Commerce Clause. So if we could limit Commerce Clause to what it was originally intended to be, or maybe not quite, but something close, you would get rid of the authority for about 40 to 50% of all federal agencies. And that's really important to me. So that would be my number 2. Number three is, and this is one people don't talk about much, but I think would be important, which is I'd love to do away with what's called the Reapportionment Act of 1913. Reapportionment Act of 1913 fixed the House of Representatives at 435 members.
Yes.
You ever wonder why there are 435 people in Congress? It's a weird number, 50 states, 435 people. The reason is because in 1913, Congress just said that's enough.
Yeah.
And weirdly, like that's it. We used to reapportion every year on the census, every 10 years, I should say, on the census. If we followed the original formula, we'd have roughly 7,000 members of the House right now. And I have people on the left to say, well, you would never get anything done. That's impossible.
Sounds great.
And the reality is the framers expected the House to be rancorous and difficult, where they couldn't get agreement and nothing would get done. It'd be very difficult to get stuff done out of there. So that would take us back to that. So I think that would help. Those things I just described would help restore what is actually now a non-representative federal government. So those would probably be my top three. If I had to go to five, I would say some form of balanced budget, but a balanced budget alone, I think is a bad idea. It'll force mandates on the states to force the states to pay for stuff.
Well, and they'll just raise taxes all the way through.
Exactly. So this is why we also need spending caps and tax limitations and the prevention of unfunded mandates in addition to a balanced budget.
I like Milton Friedman's way of doing it.
Yeah. And then finally, I would say would be, this is another one, doesn't get talked about a lot, be very popular, would be a single subject rule. And so one of the things that Congress does that I think is completely unjust to the representatives and the senators is they'll pass a bill or they get a bill onto the floor and then they tack all kinds of horrible amendments on it. Now you're a good man or woman in Congress and you've worked really hard to get, say, a water project in your district. Congress is about to vote for it and they put on the Obama library or whatever. And you're like, I don't want to vote for that. But if I want the water project, I got to vote for the Obama library. And so what we should do is break it apart. Most states have this. They call them anti-log rolling bills. One subject per bill prevents these omnibus multi-thousand page bills. So I think that would be important. I'd probably tie with that minimum 72 hours to review, page limits, things like that.
Jefferson wrote an amendment similar to that in a letter. I can't recall when that was, but yeah, very good.
So I think that's those are kind of my tops.
What about Levin's idea from the Liberty Amendments on judicial review? You know, how that's not really an Article 3 power.
Right.
It's just something that John Marshall thought was a swell idea.
Right.
And immediately implemented it. I think he's right in that it's too much of an institution these days that just acts it.
Yeah.
But I love his idea too of having state legislatures be that check on, that power that they seize.
So Levin proposed 3/5 of states can override anything that the Supreme Court does. And I think that would be an important check on the Supreme Court. The framers didn't think the Supreme Court needed any checks. They were actually worried that it would have no power, right? No purse, no sword.
Right.
Who's going to listen to a guy in a robe? Nobody's going to actually care. It's turned out now that's the supreme powerful institution.
Right.
So we do need some form of check on that. And I love a 3/5 check.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea too. Last question. 34 states sign on. We all start toasting champagne and high-fiving. Where do you think this convention is going to be? I'm curious.
So I think Congress has the right to call the convention to say time and place. They're going to say Washington, D.C. I mean, there's not 90% chance, there's 100% chance because they are D.C. So they're going to want it right there in the swamp. But I also have talked to state legislative leaders all over the country. They're not going to leave it there. So they will be required to convene in D.C. And I'm convinced they'll convene for one day and they will move it to somewhere like Dallas or Oklahoma City, Kansas,
somewhere in the middle, right?
Somewhere in maybe even Denver, somewhere in the middle of the city, hub airport. And this is important. There are practical aspects like, do you have an arena big enough to hold this thing?
Right.
All the delegations. Where can we get the technology? Because you're going to have literally there's going to be 50 delegations. There's going to be thousands of people watching. Security is a consideration. Travel's a consideration.
Do you think it's going to be an open convention like that? Or do you think it'll be a closed convention the way that the Constitutional Convention was?
I don't think it'll be closed like the Constitutional Convention. And that was private. Literally, the windows boarded up and all that stuff. I think media will be allowed to cover it. And I think that's important in this modern day and age. Transparency is super important. So I think it'll be transparent. The media at least will be in there. And even that would be such a big scrum you're probably going to need. And also delegations as big as the states want. One vote, but you could have 100 people from Texas. So I really think it's going to take an arena of some form to house this convention.
I agree. Awesome. Well, Mark Meckler, thank you so much for joining us on
Thanks
the
for
Scott
having me.
Wingerter Show.
It's my
Real
pleasure.
quick, give the pitch out to the folks of how do they get involved? How do they save the Republic?
Yeah, look, it's going to be up to you guys to save the Republic. It's not going to save itself. So go to conventionofstates.com, sign the petition to get involved. That'll go to your state legislators, but also click on the Take Action tab because we need you to do more than yell at the screen and nod in agreement. We need you guys involved. Go to conventionofstates.com.
Well, there you have it. So you can see how important this is to saving and restoring the Republic. So again, I'm going to call on you to get a hold of your state rep, get a hold of your state senator, go out there and tell them that you support an Article 5 Convention of States and that you expect them to pass that sort of legislation in their respective bodies, because that's how we're going to save America, folks. So I want to thank Mark Meckler again for agreeing to sit down and have the interview with me. I really appreciate it. And let's work together to get this done, America, because it's absolutely essential to our republic. And so thanks to Mark Meckler again and all of the volunteers for Convention of States that are out there. You guys are great. And we will see you next time. Thanks.